И имаше тук работа, къде да работят. Те са възрастни повече и по-младите ги няма тук. По чужбина, по градовете. И така. Няма работа. Тогава имаше тук, всичко имаше. Много предприятия. Тук работеха 20 човека. В това предприятие. Тук 20. Отдолу е тая сграда. 50 човека. По-натам, къде е комина. И там работеха 50 човека. Много народ. Заплатите беха по-малки, ама по-ефтино беше всичко през комунизма. И тогава ходехме и на море, ходехме на Пампорово, на Балкан. А сега заплатите са големи, но всичките не могат да ходят на море, на Балкан. Нямат възможност.
Вероятно няма гъла.
А сега няма работа. Само тук работят. На газ станция. И тук има бодигарди. 6 човека и край. И друго нищо. Академията у Москва за 20 дена екскурзия. Не съм дал на стотинк. В Германия одих без пари. 20 дена. Консумола не праща. И какво сакаш? А сега идиш некъде не мога. Я не мога идем сега до морето.
You're in the rant wormhole where I rant about whatever it is the $5 patrons of my Patreon tell me to rant about. This one's for Anime Watcher. He wants me to rant about the communism or socialism equals no food meme. Now, on its surface alone, this is just a bold-faced lie. Because if you look at even the CIA's reports that they did, there was a specific document that was declassified by the CIA in 2007 talking about how the Soviet Union in the 1980s had a better diet than America. They had eaten a lot more grains, fish, and generally more healthy things. Go figure, because a rationally planned economy leads to better things being produced. And so, all of the data that we have would seem to suggest that the USSR had a better quality of life than the majority of countries, not just the majority of its contemporaries. I mean, they talk about bread lines, this and that. But in the late period of the Soviet Union, the very, very late period before the dissolution happened, they had actually had more grain production than ever. It was just as a result of Gorbachev's market reforms and a lot of mistakes that were made in how the resources were allocated that you ended up having shortages, as well as the arms race that was occurring at the time. And so, of course, you had people going to these breadlines because there was a strain put on the economy by the arms race. But they were in breadlines to go buy food. You know, these were stores that they were going to go get things. They had the money for it. And they got the food. It was just that they had to wait quite some time to get it. The actual death rates due to starvation in the earlier period of the Soviet Union, the one that everyone obsesses on, Holodomor this and that, um, a lot of the starvation that occurred at the time was as a result of the conditions that already existed within the Russian Empire. 1917, of course there's going to be tons of famine because first of all, you're invaded by 17 other countries. Not going to be super easy to allocate food when you're being invaded by 17 other countries. But even before that point, if you look at the rates of death that occurred in the Russian Empire due to famine, it's quite staggering. The infrastructure was not there because they lived in a semi-feudalist society. In other words, they were at the stage of development in which capitalism did exist in the Russian Empire, but it existed unevenly. Most of the country was feudalist. They still had lords and serfs and stuff. And so, of course, in a society like that, you're going to have a lot of people starving. That's just the way it works. You're not developed enough to not do that. And when the Bolsheviks had the revolution, you have to put in mind that they were working with conditions that were not necessarily applicable to feed everyone yet. They had to develop. And if you look at the rates of development that happened, in the 1930s, they had the 5-year industrial plan, which ultimately ended up kicking the Nazis' asses, which no other country could have done that. No other country could have had 5 years in which they just industrialized the whole country and modernized the army. No country would have been able to do that without the strength of central planning. And they were able to end up protecting the Soviet Union because of that. I mean, like 10 million Russians died in World War II. Like, the United States and the UK did not even help that much. There were a lot of studies that were done by historians that have come out at this point that suggest that the Soviet Union still could have won without the help of the United States and the UK, And so the army had to get really powerful in order to ward off foreign threats because, like I said, after the revolution happened, they were invaded by more than 10 countries. And, when you're trying to develop your country and protect it from foreign threats, there's lots of foreign espionage going on and things like that, you're gonna want to be able to modernize and industrialize in order to protect your country from foreign invaders, which, as history had shown by that point, were a very real thing. Hitler was rising around the 1930s. They needed to industrialize in order to protect the country. And what do you know? Before World War II was initiated, the actual growth rates of the Soviet economy were soaring. The Soviet Union was the only country in the Great Depression that had GDP growth, real GDP growth, and the entire world was looking to them for advice and ways to get out of this capitalist crisis. A lot of FDR's core ideas that were implemented in the New Deal were ideas directly taken from the Soviet Union, the 8-hour workday, and so on. And so, when you look at what FDR did to use elements of central planning within a liberal economy and how that ultimately saved capitalism from the Great Depression, and globally that influence still very much exists, you have to look at the Soviet Union for who made those ideas. If you look at the fact that they were, a joke, a shitty feudalist country, and then in the 1960s they put the first man in space, there's no doubt in my mind that they were able to build and create lots of great things. And like I said, even the CIA admitted it, that they had more food, better food than us, stateside, better diets. And so I just think it's not true. Like, any level of even basic research that you can do will suggest that it is not true. A lot of these ideas tend to come from the Black Book of Communism, which the authors of the book actually disavowed themselves. Harvard University did a study. They said, hey, this is pretty wrong. You did some stupid stuff here. And then the people who wrote the book disavowed it. And yet, in a lot of schools, they still directly cite the book. In fact, in a lot of academic texts, they cite the Black Book of Communism, even though the authors of the book disavowed it and they said it's incorrect. You know, they made a lot of like really wild claims about Maoist China that they just said, yeah, this is just not true, you know. And I believe in the book they claimed that Pol Pot was a Marxist, which is obviously not true. He was a CIA backed puppet. You know, Margaret Thatcher and all these people, they had backed Pol Pot in order to keep him in power, in order to stop Soviet influence in South America. From, hey, this is Star from the Future. I said South America in that point. What I meant to say was Southeast Asia. Anyway, continue. Wouldn't call that guy a Marxist. Like, one of the things he did was actually destroy a lot of technology. Marxism is about building things. It's about raising people out of poverty and giving everyone a job, you know, building things, making the society better than it was before. You look at Pol Pot, all he did was just kill a bunch of people, you know, he actually broke down technology. And so, I really don't know how you could construe that he's a Marxist when he was supported by the USA and the UK and all of these weird... The Soviet Union actually defeated Pol Pot. That's the thing, is that they were the ones who came in and they got rid of him. So, I wouldn't call the deaths under the Khmer Rouge part of socialism, so the fact that that would even be included in there for a lot of people automatically disavows their argument and makes it wrong. Same thing with China, is that with China, like, the conditions of the country, it was a feudalist country, and then the Maoists came in, and they ended up raising the living standard, drastically raising the living standard. The life expectancy in the country was like 30 years old at the time Mao came to power. And then by the 1970s, it had raised by like 30 years. That's unheard of numbers occurring there. And it's as a result of the strength of central planning of socialism. And I don't know how people can discount that. Like, if you look at the objective amounts of growth that occurred as a result of these policies, then you can easily construe that it leads to more food occurring. Now, people say, you know, oh, Venezuela, Cuba, look at it, starvation, death, calculation problem, all this other nonsense. And in the case of Venezuela, it should be looked at that about 70% of Venezuela's GDP, or rather their industry, is privately owned. I actually have to plug in my phone right now because it's at 1%. Yeah, about 70% of Venezuela's economy is privately owned, which is not socialism. That's not how that works. You have to have a centrally planned economy to be a socialist country. And so that, flat on its face, already disproves that argument. But if you want to look at it a bit deeper, the sanctions, the economic sanctions against the country have been, quote, by the UN, they've been called a human rights abuse. That the level of economic sanctions that have been put on have disastrously destroyed the economy. And the goal of economic sanctions is to do exactly that. It's to say, we disapprove of this leader, of this country's movement, and now we have to strangle them. What's his name? Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill actually had the quote, we have to strangle the baby while it's in the carriage, in reference to the USSR. I don't see how the US's current actions against Venezuela are any different. You know, they use economic warfare, like funding paramilitary groups in the country to start riots and to destroy stores, destroy surpluses of food and grain. We've seen this of, footage of warehouses of food being burned to ground by these right-wing militants. And then if you look at, on the economic level, the amount of sanctions that are put on the country are as the same sanctions as North Korea. We put the same level of sanctions on Venezuela as we do on North Korea. And that's going to have disastrous impacts on the economy, especially given the fact that before Venezuela had the revolution, they were a colonial economy. Like 90% of their economy was based on oil. because most of the country is uninhabitable. It's a jungle. Venezuela is literally a jungle. So outside of the bigger areas, there's not a lot of inhabitable land to diversify industry, to do things like farming, or have like a bigger technological sector, or have lots of factories and industry and stuff. They just don't have that because not a lot of the land is habitable. And so most of their GDP is based on oil. So if you sanction and throttle the oil, you're going to kill the entire economy. That was one of Hugo Chavez's biggest mistakes, was not diversifying the Venezuelan economy and just kind of leaving it up to oil still, because he didn't expect the embargo or the sanctions to be as big as they are now. And so with these ginormous sanctions, of course people in Venezuela aren't going to have food, because you're putting an economic embargo on them. That's just how that works. Same thing was in the 1990s when Cuba, had to deal with the very, very arduous march when the USSR had dissolved and Cuba had stopped receiving aid from them. They didn't have a lot of food. But, they got out of that, and by the time the early 2000s had struck, you had people like George W. Bush trying to pay Cuban doctors to leave the country. They paid them so much money to leave the country and to work for the US because those doctors were some of the most highly skilled and effective doctors in the world. If you look at the Cuban healthcare system, even now, they're coming up with some of the most innovative treatments for cancer, and so on and so forth. Why? Why is that? Why is that so much of Cuba's GDP goes to public health care and leads to some of the biggest medical innovations in the world, despite the fact that it's classified as a third world country? Compared to any developing nation, it blows them out of the water. But even compared to first world nations, almost no country has as quality of universal healthcare as Cuba does. Certainly not one innovates as much as they do. And so why is that? Why is that communism starves and destroys everybody when you see Cuba making so many innovations in the medical field? A lot of these examples you just have to look at based on context. Like, obviously, there was going to be starving in the context of the Russian Revolution in the beginning because they were being invaded by so many different countries, and the land was not necessarily always tenable. The infrastructure was not always there. If you look at the rates of death due to starvation in the Russian Empire, that makes sense. They can't revolutionize all industry overnight. And, if you look at just the death tolls that come from revolution, that's true. If you look at the fact they were invaded by Nazi Germany, that's another thing. The only economic crash the country had was during the invasion by Nazi Germany. And yet somehow, right after, they were able to rebuild so much of their country, and they were able to literally put a guy on the moon. You see, most other capitalist countries, they would be picking up the pieces for so much longer, trying desperately to make everything work. But no, the Soviets, they made so many things in that time. They invented the fucking cell phone, invented the internet. Like, these are things, measurable, objective things that you can attribute to their economy. People want to give the example of North Korea and stuff. I mean, like, their conditions were pretty bad as well. Like, the monsoons in the country, just to where the country is located geographically, tend to lead to unarable land that you cannot effectively make farms on because the monsoons end up destroying so many of the crops. And so, like, you have to look at these based on the context of where they come from, and then you have to dispute them with facts and figures about how much the people actually did eat. And once you do that, I think the arguments are completely disproven, because the objective data disproves them, says they're wrong. That was my rant about the socialism equals no food meme. I hope that was adequate.